What if everything your grandmother tried to teach you in the kitchen was actually backed by hard science, and the so-called experts spent decades telling you she was wrong? Italian nonnas across the country were shamed, corrected, and laughed at by nutritionists, food safety officials, and modern chefs who thought traditional wisdom was just superstition dressed up in an apron. Well, it turns out those grandmothers were conducting accidental food science experiments every single day, and now researchers are scrambling to explain why their methods were genius all along. Here are 43 of the most banned, criticized, and forbidden cooking hacks from Italian grandmothers of the 1960s that science has finally proven right. Number 43. Leaving pasta water out overnight. Nonna would sometimes leave her salted pasta water sitting on the stovetop and use it the next morning for bread dough. Health officials called it a contamination risk, but the salt concentration in properly salted pasta water is high enough to inhibit most bacterial growth at room temperature overnight, and the starch content actually improves gluten development in bread dough, creating a softer crumb structure. Number 42. Rubbing raw garlic directly on the inside of the pot before cooking. Before making sugo, Nonna would cut a raw garlic clove and rub it along the bottom and sides of the cast iron pot. Modern chefs called this pointless, but food scientists now know this deposits allicin compounds directly onto the cooking surface, which then release gradually during the low and slow cooking process, infusing the sauce with a depth of flavor that minced garlic simply cannot replicate. Number 41. Adding a wine cork to toughened octopus while boiling. Grandmothers across southern Italy threw a wine cork into the boiling water with their octopus. Food safety boards considered this unsanitary. Research published in culinary science journals later confirmed that the cork releases tannins and specific enzymes that help break down the tough muscle proteins in the octopus, resulting in a significantly more tender texture. Number 40. Storing fresh pasta on a wooden board dusted with semolina uncovered for hours. Nonnas would leave freshly made pasta sitting out, uncovered, on a floured wooden board for up to 4 hours before cooking. Refrigeration was prescribed as mandatory by post-war food regulations, but the slight surface drying that occurs actually prevents the pasta from sticking together, and the wooden board's natural antimicrobial properties, now confirmed by university studies, kept bacteria at bay. Number 39. Putting a raw egg into meatball mixture and letting it sit before shaping. Your Nonna mixed the eggs directly into the meat mixture and then let it rest for 20 to 30 minutes before forming the balls. This was considered a food safety violation by health inspectors of the era, but the resting period allows the egg proteins to fully coat the meat fibers, creating a binding matrix that holds fat inside during cooking and produces a dramatically juicier meatball. Number 38. Using the same unwashed cutting board for bread and vegetables. The wooden cutting board in a 1960s Italian kitchen was rarely washed with soap between uses. Sanitization rules were strict. However, wood harbors lactobacillus bacteria naturally, and cross-contamination between bread dough preparation and vegetable prep actually introduced beneficial microbes that enhance the flavor complexity of homemade bread over time. Number 37. Cooking tomatoes in a copper pot for hours. Many nonnas used unlined copper pots for their Sunday sauce, a practice that was banned in commercial kitchens due to copper toxicity concerns. However, at the low cooking temperatures used for slow-simmered tomato sauce, the trace copper released into the acidic tomatoes actually acts as a natural color preservative, keeping the sauce a vivid red and functioning as a mild antimicrobial agent. Number 36. Squeezing lemon juice directly onto raw meat before refrigerating. Nonna would squeeze lemon juice over chicken or veal and leave it in the refrigerator overnight before cooking. Modern butchers dismiss this, but the citric acid in lemon juice begins a mild denaturation process on the outer proteins of the meat, essentially starting a tenderizing process that mimics marination and also kills surface bacteria more effectively than refrigeration alone. Number 35. Leaving bread dough to rise inside a turned-off oven with just the pilot light on. In the 60s, gas ovens had a constant pilot light. Nonna placed her covered dough inside to rise, and food authorities worried about temperature inconsistency. The pilot light created a consistent warm environment of around 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is now recognized as the optimal temperature range for yeast activity, producing a more consistent rise than leaving dough on a countertop. Number 34. Pressing across into raw dough with a knife before letting it rise. Before her bread rose, Nonna scored a deep cross into the top with a sharp knife. Priests objected this was religious appropriation, and skeptics called it superstition. Food science now shows that scoring the dough releases surface tension in the gluten network, allowing the loaf to expand more evenly during proofing and baking, resulting in a more uniform crumb structure. Number 33. Rinsing dried pasta under cold water after cooking. This practice was heavily criticized by Italian culinary authorities who said it washed away starch. But when Nonna was preparing pasta salad or baked pasta dishes, the cold rinse stopped the cooking process immediately and prevented overcooking during baking or serving. And research shows that for dishes not served immediately, this preserves the ideal al dente texture. Number 32. Adding anchovy paste directly to the tomato sauce early and letting it dissolve completely. Nonna would push a spoonful of anchovy paste into the simmering sauce at the very beginning and let it cook down for an hour. People complained it would make everything taste fishy, but the anchovy breaks down into pure glutamate compounds during extended cooking, functioning as a natural monosodium glutamate that intensifies the umami richness of every other ingredient without any detectable fish flavor. Number 31. Keeping rendered pork fat in a ceramic jar at room temperature. Nonna kept her strutto, or rendered lard, in an open ceramic container on the counter for weeks. This horrified health inspectors. But rendered fat, when properly prepared by cooking all moisture out of the pork fat, contains almost no water and no proteins that bacteria require to grow, making it genuinely shelf-stable at room temperature for several weeks, exactly as Nonna knew. Number 30. Storing hard cheeses like pecorino unwrapped in the open air of the cellar. Wrapping cheese was considered mandatory food safety practice. Nonna let her aged pecorino sit unwrapped on a stone shelf in the cool cellar. The airflow allowed the rind to continue developing beneficial mold cultures that actually protected the interior of the cheese from harmful bacteria, mimicking the same controlled aging conditions used in professional cheese caves today. Number 29. Putting a piece of stale bread into a pot of beans while they cooked. Before refrigeration improved, Nonna dropped a chunk of yesterday's bread into the cannellini beans as they simmered. This seemed wasteful or unhygienic. The starch in the old bread leaches into the cooking liquid, thickening the broth naturally and also absorbing some of the gas-producing oligosaccharides from the beans, resulting in a more digestible and creamier final dish. Number 28. Cooking garlic until it turns completely black in olive oil intentionally. Nonna sometimes cooked garlic cloves until they were completely black before using the infused oil. Modern cooks consider this a mistake requiring the oil to be discarded, but Italian grandmothers knew that the blackened garlic and its infused oil, when used in small quantities, adds a complex bitter note that balances the sweetness of long-cooked tomatoes, a technique now embraced by Michelin-starred chefs. Number 27. Freezing Parmigiano rinds and adding them to soups straight from frozen. Nonna saved every Parmigiano rind in a bag in the freezer and dropped them frozen directly into minestrone. This was considered risky for food texture back in the 60s, but freezing actually ruptures the cell structure of the rind, causing it to release its glutamate and fat content far more rapidly into the soup broth, creating a richer flavor in a shorter cooking time than fresh rinds achieve. Number 26. Whipping egg whites in a copper bowl with a pinch of salt. This was done for torte and semifreddo. Using copper bowls was considered outdated and potentially toxic. Modern food chemistry explains that copper ions released from the bowl bond with conalbumin proteins in the egg whites, creating a more stable foam that holds its structure longer and resists collapse during folding, making copper the superior tool for this task. Number 25. Cooking risotto on very high heat and stirring constantly without adding broth gradually. Nonna sometimes broke the traditional rule and cooked her risotto on high flame with all the broth added at once, stirring furiously. Traditional Italian cooking schools called this heresy, but food scientists have since demonstrated that this aggressive method, when timed correctly, creates equally effective starch release from the rice, producing a creamy texture through sheer mechanical agitation rather than gradual addition. Number 24. Adding a splash of whole milk to scrambled eggs before whisking. Nonnas added full-fat milk to their uova strapazzate. Nutritionists in the 1960s flagged this as adding unnecessary fat and suggested water instead. But the fat molecules in whole milk coat the egg proteins and slow their coagulation during cooking, giving a wider window of perfect texture and producing eggs that are consistently softer and creamier than their watery counterparts. Number 23. Using the pasta cooking water to wash the serving bowl before plating. Before serving pasta, Nonna would swirl a ladle of hot pasta water inside the ceramic bowl to warm it, then discard the water. This seemed wasteful, but warming the bowl prevents thermal shock from dropping hot pasta into a cold dish, which rapidly drops the pasta temperature and causes gluten to firm up, keeping the pasta softer and better coated in sauce for longer at the table. Number 22. Letting soup sit for a full day before eating. Nonna always made soup the day before and reheated it the next day. Food safety authorities warned against storing cooked soups outside proper cooling protocols. But during the resting period, starch retrogradation occurs and fat globules reorganize within the broth, developing a more layered and complex flavor that freshly made soup simply cannot achieve. The flavors genuinely meld on a molecular level overnight. Number 21. Hanging fresh sausages near the kitchen window with no refrigeration for a day. During cooler months, fresh homemade sausages would hang by the window to cure for 24 hours before cooking. Health officials would have prohibited this immediately. But the surface drying during this period creates a pellicle layer of dried proteins that seals in moisture during subsequent cooking, producing a juicier interior and helping the natural casing hold together without splitting. Number 20. Cracking raw eggs into wine and drinking the mixture as a sauce over pasta. This egg and wine mixture, sometimes called la spronza del povero, was used as a quick pasta sauce. The idea of raw eggs concerned health boards, but dry white wine contains enough acid to begin partially denaturing the raw egg proteins, and when tossed immediately with hot pasta, the residual heat completes the cooking in a safe and controlled way, similar to the carbonara technique but even faster. Number 19. Soaking wooden spoons in salt water overnight. Nonna submerged her wooden cooking spoons in a bowl of heavy saltwater solution overnight, a practice health inspectors found unnecessary. Research now shows that osmotic pressure from the salt solution draws moisture and trapped food particles out of the wood grain, while the salt itself kills surface microbes more effectively than dish soap, which can leave residue in the porous wood fiber. Number 18. Adding sugar to tomato sauce while it still has acidic bite. Nonnas pinch sugar into their sauce early in the cooking process rather than at the end. Nutritionists and traditionalists back in 1960s criticized this, but adding sugar early allows it to caramelize subtly during the long cooking process, which adds depth rather than simple sweetness, and also raises the pH of the acidic tomatoes sooner, allowing other flavor compounds to develop more fully throughout the entire cooking period. Number 17. Wrapping meat in dampened newspaper before a short rest. After roasting a chicken or a piece of veal, Nonna would sometimes wrap it briefly in slightly dampened newspaper while it rested. This sounded completely unsanitary, but the damp paper creates a microsteam environment that maintains surface moisture while the meat rests, keeping the exterior from drying out and allowing internal juices to redistribute more evenly than uncovered resting allows. Number 16. Putting eggplant slices in a colander with a heavy pot on top for an hour. Before frying, Nonna pressed salted eggplant under weight for a full hour. This was dismissed as unnecessary by modern cooks who said rinsing was sufficient. The weighted pressing removes significantly more moisture than salting alone, collapsing the cellular air pockets inside the eggplant flesh, which means the slices absorb dramatically less oil during frying and become crispier rather than soggy. Number 15. Cooking polenta only with a wooden spoon and never metal. Metal utensils were used for almost everything else, but Nonna insisted on wood for polenta. Nobody had a good reason. Wood has much lower thermal conductivity than metal, meaning the spoon does not absorb and carry heat away from the cooking polenta, which maintains a more consistent temperature at the contact point and prevents the starch from sticking and burning at the bottom of the pot as easily. Number 14. Storing olive oil in a dark bottle sealed with a cork rather than a cap. This was common before commercial bottling. The cork, unlike a tight metal cap, allows a microscopically small amount of air exchange while preventing large-scale oxidation. This tiny air exchange actually allows volatile compounds in extra virgin olive oil to develop rather than becoming trapped and turning the oil rancid faster, which is the same principle behind aging wine with a cork. Number 13. Using breadcrumbs fried in olive oil instead of cheese on some pasta dishes. In certain poorer regions and families, Nonna replaced expensive Parmigiano with toasted breadcrumbs fried in olive oil. This was considered a poverty substitution to be ashamed of. But Maillard reaction compounds created during the browning of breadcrumbs and fat produce nearly identical savory, nutty flavor compounds to those found in aged cheese, and the crunchy texture provides a superior contrast to soft pasta. Number 12. Cooling hot espresso with a spoon before drinking to improve flavor. Nonna always let her espresso cool slightly and stirred it before the first sip. Espresso purists insisted it should be drunk immediately. But human taste receptors for bitterness are significantly less sensitive at temperatures below 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and cooling espresso by just 10 to 15 degrees reveals nuanced flavor notes that are completely masked at scalding temperatures. Number 11. Adding dried lentils to bread dough to improve texture. Nonna sometimes ground dried lentils into a coarse flour and mixed them into bread dough at a ratio of about 1:8. Bakers considered this adulteration. Lentil flour contains high levels of natural lecithin, a lipid that functions as an emulsifier within the dough, improving moisture retention during baking and producing a bread that stays soft significantly longer than wheat-only loaves. Number 10. Cooking dried pasta in a covered pot for the first minute only. Nonna covered the pot immediately after adding pasta, brought it back to boil under the lid, then removed the cover. The textbook said never cover cooking pasta. The brief covered period dramatically accelerates the return to boiling. After the cold pasta enters the water, ensuring the starch on the pasta surface gelatinizes quickly and evenly, which prevents the pasta from becoming gummy during the remaining open cooking. Number 9. Preserving fresh herbs under salt rather than drying them. Nonna packed fresh basil and oregano layers alternating with coarse sea salt in glass jars. Drying was the approved preservation method, but salt preservation draws moisture out through osmosis while keeping cellular structure more intact than heat drying does, preserving volatile aromatic compounds that evaporate during drying, resulting in herbs that are genuinely closer in flavor to fresh than their dried counterparts. Number 8. Never washing fresh mushrooms with water, but wiping them only with a dry cloth. Health guidelines said mushrooms should be rinsed. Nonna refused and used a dry cloth. Mushrooms absorb water almost instantly through their porous surface, and even a brief rinse increases their moisture content enough to cause steaming rather than searing in the pan, resulting in a rubbery texture. Dry wiping is now the scientifically recommended method in professional kitchens worldwide. Number 7. Boiling pasta in less water than directed with more salt. Standard advice said to use a large pot of water. Nonna used a smaller pot with highly concentrated salt water. When pasta cooks in less water, the released starch concentrates in the cooking water much faster, creating an intensely starchy liquid that is far superior for emulsifying pasta sauces, while the high salt concentration seasons the pasta more deeply in the shorter time available. Number 6. Adding a splash of red wine vinegar to the water when poaching eggs. Nonna's egg poaching water always had a splash of red wine vinegar rather than white. The acid in the vinegar helps the outer egg white coagulate faster upon contact with the hot water, preventing the white from spreading into feathery wisps. Red wine vinegar specifically contains additional tannin compounds beyond simple acidity that further encourage protein tightening, producing a more compact and aesthetically perfect poached egg. Number 5. leaving garlic unpeeled when roasting vegetables. Into any roasting pan, Nonna threw whole unpeeled garlic cloves among the vegetables. Recipes always called for peeled garlic. The papery skin acts as a natural protective membrane during high heat roasting, preventing the outer surface of the clove from charring before the interior becomes sweet and jammy. When squeezed out after roasting, the flesh is dramatically more caramelized and complex than peeled cloves roasted the same way. Number 4. Tossing pasta in the pan with sauce for exactly 2 minutes over high heat. Nonna finished every pasta dish by tossing it furiously in the saucepan over high flame for a specific 2-minute period. This seemed like theater. The vigorous tossing creates rapid emulsification between the fat in the sauce and the starchy pasta water, forming a coating that clings to every strand of pasta rather than sitting in a pool below it, which is the foundation of every great Italian pasta dish. Number 3. Using the heel of stale bread to thicken sauces instead of flour. Rather than making a roux or adding cornstarch, Nonna submerged a chunk of stale bread into a simmering sauce and mashed it in completely. Culinary training programs considered this primitive and imprecise. Stale bread contains a higher concentration of retrograded starch than fresh bread, which dissolves into cooking liquid more uniformly than raw flour, and creates a sauce body that is smoother, less gluey, and with a more complex flavor base. Number 2. Resting homemade pasta dough for a full hour wrapped in a damp cloth. Standard recipes said 30 minutes was adequate. Nonna insisted on a full hour under a damp cloth rather than plastic wrap. The damp cloth allows minimal moisture exchange between the cloth and the dough, preventing the surface from drying, while the gluten network fully relaxes over the extended time. A fully relaxed gluten network rolls thinner without springing back, making pasta that is silkier in texture and cooks more uniformly. Number 1, and the most banned by doctors in the 1960s, cooking everything in cast iron and never washing it with soap. Nonna's cast iron pan was wiped with a dry cloth, never touched by dish soap, and passed down for generations. Health departments told people this was unsanitary and dangerous, but the polymerized fat layer built up over decades of cooking creates a genuinely non-stick, chemically stable surface that soap destroys by breaking down the polymer bonds. The women who built these habits back in the 1960s were not ignorant, and they were never just following superstition. They were accumulating empirical knowledge through thousands of hours of observation, trial, and repetition across generations before the word scientist ever entered a kitchen. The tragedy is that an entire generation was conditioned to see their grandmothers as outdated rather than ahead of their time. Next time someone tells you that you are cooking wrong, maybe ask them how long their family has been cooking that way, and then ask yourself if your nonna would agree.